Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. That was a little Luke Combs, Loving on You. And he says that he's in love with loving on you. And that's kind of how I feel about Israel only. I'm in love with it. And the reason why I'm in love with it is because it makes so much freaking sense. It makes so much sense of the Bible. It makes so much sense of the story that has confused people endlessly for centuries. It's right there under your nose. It's the elephant in the room. It's the obvious, painfully obvious factoid. And it's just incredibly satisfying to fill the blanks and fit the pieces in and connect things and just see how beautiful of a story it actually is. And so some people might say, well, yeah, you're obsessed with Israel only. That's why you'd never understand or hear any objections, or you'll never consider any objections. But that is poppycock. That is nonsensical jibber jabber. Okay? That makes no sense. I came from all the views that you currently hold. Or not you. I shouldn't say you, because I guess I always assume that I am arguing against somebody on this channel, and I want to get away from that. I don't want to be that guy. I want to present the facts in a calm, respectable manner. And so I don't want to say you. But I'll say that I was in the views before the views were cool. Well, not really, because I'm only 38 years old. It's only, that was maybe like 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. But I came through all the different positions that are debated and accepted and used against IO. I came through all those. And do you think that if I wasn't fully convinced in my heart of hearts with overloads of evidence for the view, do you think that I would have taken the IO position? I mean, what good would that have done me? I was sold out for this Christian thing. And then as I started to study more and become a little bit more critical in my studies and say, well, this so-called thing that we're looking for at the end of days, this return of Jesus, actually took place in those last days that the New Testament refers to. It was actually a finishing event, a grand finale type event of those last days. And it actually capped off and finished Israel's old covenant history. The Messiah came for them. I don't see anything in the story that says anything other than that. And I took a hard look at the Old Testament, and that was really the kicker. That was when it all kind of fell into place and clicked. And that's partly the theme, or that is the theme of today's short audio. I don't even know what I'm going to title it yet, because I just decided I was going to do this like 2.5 minutes ago. So, let's see. The theme and the subject of this audio is going to be who's more out of line, right? Let's just put it that way. Who's more out of line? Is it me and Israel only who says that the New Testament last days, what the person in Acts asked Jesus, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? I contend that whole thing right there, that whole ingathering of these elect ones, these sheep, that whole ingathering was Israel. That was the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being gathered back in before the coming of the Messiah. And some people disagree. Some people say I'm out of line. So I wanted to just throw a few things out from the from the Old Testament, and ask the question, who's more out of line? Is it me as IO, or is it the Christian today as a futurist, as a preterist, as a partial preterist, as a millennialist, as a Calvinist, as an Arminian, if that's what you call them, I don't know. But who's more out of line? Okay, and we'll start just with a couple of factoids. Looking at Israel in the Old Testament texts, specifically Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, And looking at Israel through the Old Testament prophets, specifically Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, we find the bulk of our meat. We find the bulk of our juicy nuggets, right? We should study those places long and hard because they're going to give us factual information upon this people called Israel, who even the preterist of all preterists, even the dispensationalist of all dispensationalists, even the replacement theologist of all replacement theologists would admit that Israel is a huge part of this book we call the Bible. There's something up with Israel, right? They're always defined as this special treasure, this chosen people, this divine race who is given this covenant. There's something up with them. And so when we look at these places in the Old Testament, we can see a lot of clear information, which begs the question, who's more out of line? Okay. For instance, in the very beginning of the tale, in the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses is sort of outlining this covenant contract with the Israelites, they're all standing before him, is the scene, and he's yelling and speaking to them about this covenant contract that their God and their God alone had given them and given them alone. And in that discourse, through that discourse, many times actually, Moses speaks of times in the future. Sometimes he phrases it as in the latter days, actually. The Israelites would be paganized, they would be dispersed, they would be worshiping the work of men's hands, wood, stone, idols. They would be so far from the covenant commandments of their God. They would be lost and scattered and dispersed throughout these nations, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, living just like those who didn't know God. And yet, God would turn, have mercy upon them, and remember the covenant contract that he made with their fathers. This is what Moses says. He would turn and remember the covenant contract that he made with their fathers, right? Okay, now, when I come to the New Testament, sorry, I'm just driving right now. When I come to the New Testament and I see things like endless statements about Israel and little hints that these are the elect, these are the sheep being gathered in, no matter where they were, whether they were near or far, circumcised or uncircumcised, when I see statements that shout that out to me, I instantly think back to those promises of Moses, right? And I say, well, this is going to be tough to prove because on the one hand, you have the futurist, the inconsistent full preterist, the Christian today who says that this is all about them. But on the other hand, you have the Bible, the very book that they're studying, just the portions that they don't really look at, saying that there was going to come a time in the future where the Israelites were dispersed, living as pagans, and God would call them back and have mercy upon them because he would remember the covenant that he made with their father Abraham. So I see that and I ask myself, who's more out of line? Am I out of line for taking the stance that I do, that that's actually fulfilling the promises to Israel? Or are you out of line, or is the Christian out of line for taking the stance that that doesn't mean Israel, that means them today? Even though you'd be hard-pressed to really figure out what a gospel mission is today. I mean, there really is none. Like, what are people doing? There's no proof of the Holy Spirit. They don't get baptized and speak in tongues. There's no Holy Spirit powers out there healing people. I mean, there's nothing, which, of course, works in my favor. Here's another one, okay? In the Old Testament, we have the promise that Israel, the two houses of Israel, were going to be split. They were going to be divided. There was going to be enmity. There was going to be a lack of peace. There was going to be conflict. We see that actually happened. We see that these ones went away. These ones stayed home. There was endless conflict over the law. That's all throughout the Old Testament, right? Endless conflict over the law. the two houses arguing. They had different places of worship, Mount Gerizim and then Jerusalem. The two houses of Israel had endless conflict over the law. And that's all it speaks of in the Old Testament. Yet when we come to the New Testament and we see that Paul in Ephesians saying that he came to preach peace to those who were near and peace to you who are afar off, breaking down the middle wall of enmity, that is, the laws of commandments contained in ordinances, because he nailed those laws to the cross. You were dead in trespasses and sins. You were dead in the uncircumcision of your foreskin or of your flesh. You were dead in that trespass. Well, who do you think Paul's speaking to? Who's more out of line? Is it me that says that Paul's actually sort of playing off the endless examples of conflict between the two houses of Israel in the Old Testament? He's playing off the endless examples of enmity over the law in the Old Testament, and he's just using that and running with it? I mean, who's more out of line? Is it me? Or is it the Christian today who says that that's actually about them? Right? Somehow, some way, God came to break down the enmity between Joe Blow in 2021 and the ancient Jews who held the Mosaic Law to such a high esteem. Do you see how ridiculous that is, right? I mean, when did you or anyone you know ever have enmity over the law of Moses with anyone? You never did. You never did. All right, so how is this how is this about you today? It can't be about you today. So who's more out of line? Another example I can think of in the prophet Ezekiel. We have Ezekiel speaking of the two-stick prophecy. Right? He's speaking of the two houses of Israel. He's speaking how they were divided. The entire prophetic portion in Ezekiel is all about the Israelites, both houses, northern and southern, being brought back together, being made new. And the prophet describes that as two sticks being joined together. Well, we come to Paul in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 10, I believe it is, maybe 11, and Paul's giving a two-stick analogy, two branches. And he's talking about the two branches being grafted together. He's talking about the wild branch and the natural branch. And people really look at those words like they're gold. Like, oh, look, natural means bloodline and this means others. No, it's just metaphor. It's just picture imagery of what's taking place. One branch was wild, one was natural. One branch existed in the wild, that being out in the nation, scattered, lost. The other branch was natural. The other branch stayed home to fulfill that prodigal son parable of the son who stayed home with God, the Father. And the other son ran out to the nations, of course. So we have that two-branch, that two-stick analogy of Paul and Romans, and yet somehow people argue against me saying that I'm more out of line because I actually believe that that's tied directly to Ezekiel. I'm out of line. No. You're out of line for thinking that somehow you're one of those branches. The prophets never spoke of you. They spoke of Israel. Here's another one. Genesis chapter 48. We have the promise. Jacob makes the promise that Ephraim would become a fullness of nations. Ephraim, folks, you know who Ephraim is, right? That's the northern kingdom. That's the tribe of Israel the northern kingdom was given the name Ephraim. And they were given the name Ephraim. Okay, now take it for what you will. That name is used to sort of refer to the entirety of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. So was Jacob saying that the descendants of the 10 tribes would become a fullness of nations? I think it's very possible. Or was he saying that particular tribe, Ephraim, that his descendants would become a fullness of nations. Right? I mean, either way works, because either way, it's still about the descendants of Israel, the descendants of the 12 tribes. Either way it works, folks. But now who's more out of line? Right? We come to Paul in Romans 11, and he says, he's talking about this mission, and he says, and so when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, or when the fullness of the nations comes in, that's actually the translation, fullness of nations. In this way, all Israel will be saved. So how was all Israel saved, according to Paul? Well, they were saved, or they would be saved, when the fullness of the nations would be brought in, would be gathered in, would be restored, would be made whole, would be reconciled. That's how all Israel would be saved. Now, does that mean that the fullness of the nations was the entirety of the 10 tribes? Ephraim's descendants? Perhaps. Or does that mean that the fullness of the nations was sort of referring to the tribe of Ephraim only? Because his descendants would become a fullness of nations? Perhaps. But folks, either way, it's still Israel. It doesn't matter. And guess what? Who's more out of line? Is it me for saying that Paul's actually pulling from that Old Testament imagery and, picture there? Because that's all he does in the New Testament, and if you deny that, you're a bonehead? Who's more out of line? Or is it you who say that you're the fullness of the nations? Right? I'm the fullness of the nations. Like forcing yourself into a place that you don't belong. Let's see. Can I think of any more off the top of my dome? There's a ton of them. There's an absolute ton of them. I don't know. I really don't know. We can look at Jeremiah. The promise in Jeremiah 31 of the new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And here's the author of Hebrews quoting that in those last days about this new covenant that was being made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Well, where is everybody else? Where is everybody else, right? Who's more out of line? Is it me for saying that the New Testament, the last days, the new covenant was only for Israel because that's what's predicted in the Old Testament? Or is it you for saying that you're part of that new covenant? Where's everybody else in the book of Hebrews? Now you might say, well, it's the book of Hebrews. That's why nobody else is there. Nonsense. You have an answer for everything, but none of it makes any sense. James wrote to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Well, where's everybody else? Well, James didn't want to write to everybody else that time. Nonsense. You have an answer for everything. Peter wrote to the elect of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, all over the known lands, all in the nations. The elect of the dispersion. Well, was Peter just kind of like referring to Israelites in those regions and leaving everybody else out of it? Nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. That would be like me writing a letter to my parents, but only referring to my mom and leaving my dad out. It doesn't work that way. Peter wrote to the elect in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, Cappadocia, and he referred to them as the elect of the dispersion. Okay? Dispersed, elect, chosen Israelites living in nations far and wide, folks. That's all this is about. So I ask you one final time as I close out today to bow your heads and close your eyes. No, I'm just kidding. Who's more out of line, folks? Is it me, Jason DaCosta, Israel only? Is it me for taking everything that the Old Testament says and giving it a hard look when I come to the New? And drawing conclusions on the New based on the Old? Or is it the Christian today who looks at everything in the New, ignores everything in the Old, assumes everything in the New is about them, with little to no clue that there's tons of trajectory information located in the back of that book that they never read? It's a simple answer, folks, and you know the answer. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll give it a like, a Rooski. Leave a comment if you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Hopefully it made sense, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.